Welcome to the next lecture on requirements engineering. So now that we have finished the requirements analysis of the requirements engineering process, we'll now look into requirements management. First, we're going to talk about requirements management in a little bit more detail today, before then moving on to change management. So let's move on to management of requirements in general now. First, motivation. Why do you need to manage requirements in the first place? Some of those bullet points that we're listing now seem to be a little bit on the nose, like the number and scope of requirements, and further information becomes at some point quite big, especially in more complex projects, that you need some kind of a system or approach to really take care of them. You have to manage the document for the requirements to manage them in a certain way, but there are more information outside the document, and you also have to first get to this document to use it to manage your requirements. But there are more and more information involved that might not make it into this document or that pertain to the general process of the requirements engineering. So the number of scope of requirements and further information is one of the reasons why you at some point have a huge amount of information that needs to be managed. Then you also have the expected product lifetime. How long is your product supposed to live? The longer it lives, the more people and stakeholders will be involved in the product. People will leave, people will join, and they need something first to find all the information, but then also there needs to be a certain process of managing that. The rate of changes to requirements and related documents also needs management. How do you do this? What's the process there? The number of stakeholders and the availability of stakeholders requires some management administration. The heterogeneous nature of your stakeholder opinions. Those are all factors that somehow need a little bit of management. They don't just happen. And then it's also helpful in respect to future reusability and the number of expected releases, but there are many, many more reasons why you should care about managing your requirements or where the management of requirements is required. Next question could be, what exactly needs to be managed? I briefly touched on this in the last slide. The requirements for sure are part of those things that needs to be managed, but then there are also things like the definitions, the goals, the assumptions, and the test cases that are somehow part of the requirements engineering use case and the product or the project that you need to build, create for your customer. User stories, epics, use cases, architecture descriptions, all of this also gets in there, but also management related things like change requests and issues that you might track with something like GitLab are also part of the things that might need to be managed. Depending on what size of a project you have, you might have all of those things that we just listed, or even more, because maybe we forgot some, or just a subset of those. So after the more intuitive explanation of why you need to manage your requirements and what needs to be managed, now the more proper definition of management in requirements engineering. It's a process of managing existing requirements and requirements-related work products, including the storing and changing and tracing of requirements. Also related to traceability, which we'll cover in the next lecture. There are various types to manage requirements. It also depends once again on what type of project you have, but also mostly on the complexity of your project. You could have something like a simple information model where you have an information type and then something like subcategories like requirements, test cases, architectural descriptions, explanations, and further categories. You could also work with more complex information models where you have a more complex structure with subcategories, but also with relations among those. As I said, depends on your project. And then, of course, you also can rely on the standardized structures and templates of the requirements documents that we already discussed earlier. They also give you a way of managing and structuring your requirements. So they can help with this, but often like you don't put everything in the final product and there's more to be managed. That doesn't really make sense to do this like in a Word document where you have your V model XT or something like that.